So much so that he's able to reinvest some of his wealth by then loaning it to the government so that they can wage more war. You get a kind of cycle going on here. Well, capital accumulation by individuals. He gets wealthy enough that he buys a big estate in Surrey, Grattan Park, which is still standing today, with several thousand acres of land surrounding in the home counties, the wealthiest part of the nation. He's not alone. There's everyone who was involved, and there's three main partnership clusters that are involved in contracting the military from 1755 to 1765. Every one of them is operating like this. So, the point I'm trying to get across here is that we can't just merely look at the 7 Years' War from a purely military or even political diplomatic perspective. It has roots that are economic in nature, and the economic interests of certain people within British society are largely driving it. Merchants who will profit from the expansion of British imperialism, and army officers who have property rights in the military, so expansion of the military opens up greater opportunities for scions of the landed classes. At any point, if you want to ask the question, please feel free to raise your hand. And moving on to the next section, this is actually the raising of the army, mobilization. I argue that recruitment, mobilization can be understood as proletarianization in Marxist terms, separating of people from the means of production. Classic drawing of what recruits were seen to look at in the time, and a bit of a song there that explains a lot of the motivation for people going into work. Difficult economic times make the military an attractive occupation. You get guarantees on clothing, usually, food, usually, and pay on a daily basis. This is the composition ethnically of the British Army in America in 1757. You can see it's not purely an English army. Significant components are coming from the other dominions under British rule at the time. Basically 30% English and slightly less of both Irish and Scottish, and then 5% are coming from Germans who were recruited in the German principalities in Europe. Also Germans who had already immigrated to the colonies, and then other people from the colonies who were recruited. What's important about this isn't just the ethnic breakdown, but what I argue is that you have to look at each one of these situations to understand why people are joining the military. Most people, when they talk about the army this time, are usually talking about it in the English context. The English context is not typical for most of these areas. England is more advanced towards industrialization by this time. There's already reorganization of production going on. A lot more people have been thrown out of work as a result of that. And in England, you see a lot of people who register their previous occupation as skilled trades, which had already gone through reorganization of productions. Weaving, shoemaking, and tailoring. But if you look at Scotland, it's an entirely different thing. In part, it's conditioned by the failed Jacobite uprising of 1745, but it's also because that gave the English an excuse to move in and seize a lot of lands from the failed uprising. They tried a policy of improving Scottish agriculture, and it leads to a breakdown of traditional clan, feudal land labor relationships. And you see a reorganization of production going on now and being set on a more commercial basis than had been before, where it had been more subsistence. The same is largely true when you look at Ireland in this period as well. The peasant clock and the traditional small landholding settlement pattern of Ireland is coming under the same sorts of pressures. Well, in the north of Ireland, you have disruptions to the linen production occurring at the same time. So you have to look at each sort of setting and seeing what sort of factors are factoring into why people are employing. And the Germans who are being recruited as volunteers in this era are coming along a strip along the Rhine. And that's an area that has actually been at peace since the previous batch of wars in the late 17th century. But because of that, they've got further advanced economically in terms of agrarian landholding. than elsewhere. And there was beginning to be pressures on the land and surplus people being thrown off the land. That's why a lot of Germans were immigrating as indentured servants to Pennsylvania and places like that too. But they're also going into the military as an option. And then if you look at America, and America's a different situation, because in these other places you're talking about all these sorts of pressures downward on employers, but in America you're talking about a labor scarcity. And that puts more kind of control into the hands of citizens to decide whether they want to enlist or not. And Fred Anderson has talked a lot about this, about Massachusetts recruits growing into the provincial regiments. Elsewhere, the case isn't as rosy as he presents, and in Virginia, it's not the same story. A lot of marginal people get pushed, pressed into the military. And it's interesting that the press is more operational by the colonies than it is in England for the army. The English army only uses the press 2 times in this period, and they hardly get any soldiers that way, less than 1,000. We had a discussion about this earlier. It's probably because in part the opinion of what the army is like, but it's also I think because the government's privileging the Navy in terms of impressing over the army, because the Navy has more needs. So you have to look at every area to understand why people what things are factoring into why they're joining the military. It's not just a decision that an individual makes at a moment in time. You have to historicize that decision to see whether there's, if not coercion, whether there's pressures that make the military look more attractive than elsewhere at that time. And at this particular moment in particular, this is the peak of recruiting in Britain. And in Britain, there's an economic depression with a lot of people thrown out of work. There's a famine in Scotland in 1757, and there's famine, also a minor famine going on in Ireland. So you have to factor these things in about why people are making the decision to join the army. Lord Loudon. He was a commander under Cumberland at Culloden, a repressor of the Scots, although he's wearing his kilt proudly here. He was an irascible individual, did not believe that civilians, even if they're elected officials, should have any say over military issues. And when he came in as commander-in-chief in 1756 after the death of Braddock, he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. He adopted fairly aggressive recruiting policy. Some people complained that they were getting people drunk or beating them senseless and then recruiting them against their will. He also tried to quarter the troops on civilians' houses, and that caused a lot of uproars everywhere. In Philadelphia, New York, Albany, Boston, they all resisted. His response was to threaten to send the army in and impose quartering on them. In the end, it ended up being a kind of a saw-off that most of the colonies decided to either build or provide alternative space that wasn't in civilian homes. Another issue that caused a lot of controversy was the embargo. He wanted to enforce an embargo on trading to prevent smuggling to the French in this area, and that led to a lot of protest against his rule. There were also issues, particularly with the Massachusetts provincials, about rank, and whether colonial officers' rank should be equivalent to regular officers, and amongst the soldiers about discipline. None of the provincial troops wanted to serve under British Army discipline for good reason. But by 1757, they were forced to. And this is where when I first thought about this project, this was going to be the heart of it, thinking about just what soldiers do as work and breaking that down. But it's grown much bigger since then. A lot of what soldiers do, and you just have to read any soldier diaries tells you, is just menial labor done regularly, very boring, can be a very physical, manual labor, and you're doing this under military discipline, quite often with NCOs watching over you with a cane or with a halberd, so they can strike you if you're not working hard enough. Much of the time, soldiers are just doing this sort of work, and it's considered part of what they should be doing as a soldier, part of what they get their sixpence for. There is also a lot of what I call civil work being performed by soldiers in this period. In 1757, again, not only did they take records on the ethnicity, they took records on former occupations. And anyone who had skills that could be deployed by the military, tailors in particular, shoemakers, ones that could either make or repair clothing, were set to work at those tasks. They would get additional pay for that. Usually it worked out to be about the equivalent of the same day page that you were getting as a soldier, so you were getting paid twice. In 1757, the regimental reports indicated that up to about 19% of soldiers were actually performing this additional work. It didn't become an issue with regard to competing with civilian labor because a lot of this work was being done on the frontier. So unlike in the Boston Massacre, where it was one of the flashpoints that led on to the Boston Massacre, there's no instances of that here. The other thing to bear in mind is that you're not just talking about soldiers that are working here. The Army has a lot of civilian labor that it hires in this period. Ship carpenters, blacksmiths, all the skilled trades are being brought in to perform the work that needs to be done because there's no supporting infrastructure to the Army. Also, and it's only in the last 20 years or so that it's gotten any attention, is the role that women have played in the work of making war. Women are there in small numbers, usually about 4 to 6 per company, at least officially. You'd have a lot of other camp followers. And they would be doing a lot of labor, nursing, laundressing, things like that. It wasn't recognized or valued to any great extent by the military command, but it's an important part of what I call the social reproduction of warfare. Then there's the actually going into combat, and there's a lot of work attached to that too. If you're thinking about the campaigning that they had to undergo in the New World, often traveling great distances without any road infrastructure, a lot of movement by boat in this war, small boats. And when you get there, a lot of entrenchment digging, building of makeshift defenses, fascines, cutting down trees to do that. All sorts of ancillary labor just preparatory to going into combat. I'll be talking about the actual combat experience later, but there's a lot of work that goes into fighting as well. Living conditions of soldiers. We have a fairly idealistic representation of fortress at Crown Point here. It all looks nice and tidy. Most of the things you read in the records, however, make it sound like it's almost hell. It stinks from the latrines, everything's dirty and muddy, it's disordered, constant struggle to make men to clean up the quarters. And in the bottom pictures you see images of accommodations that soldiers could have. In a tent, 3 to 4 men to the tent. If they had bunks, 2 or 3 men to a bunk. Quite often, if you're going out on campaign, you don't have tents or anything. You're sleeping rough on pine boughs or on hay if you can get it. Doing this quite often in very cold weather in North America. Campaigning seasons at times lasted up into December in freezing weather, and soldiers are getting frostbite regularly. The British Army had a rudimentary medical system, usually 1 surgeon and a surgeon's mate per regiment. And then they would have nurses come in, soldiers' wives or consorts that would do some of the nursing. But it's very rudimentary for the most part. And yet, soldiers in this period are exposed to a lot of disease and illness. Yellow fever, malaria, some instances of cholera, dysentery, big taker of lives, and scurvy.